Welcome to Virtual Wednesdays at the DeYoung. My name is Francesca D'Alessio, and I'm so pleased that you've joined us. Tonight's program is in support of the exhibition Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI, which is now on view at the DeYoung Museum. We are so excited to host a special presentation by Ken Goldberg about AI, automation, and anxiety. Ken Goldberg is an artist, writer, inventor, and researcher in the field of robotics and automation. He is a professor and chair of the Industrial Engineering and Operations Research Department at University of California, Berkeley. Take it away, Ken.
Thank you, Fran. I appreciate it. Now, what I was going to say was that the one thing everyone can agree on right now is that we're living in a time of unprecedented anxiety. And I have to say, my own anxiety level has gone up a couple of notches since 5 p.m. when we figured out that that all of YouTube was shut down only seconds before we were about to start. But this is par for the course. We are living in an age of anxiety, and I want to talk about that today in the context of history and robots. So I first want to thank many of the collaborators and wonderful partners and students I've worked with over the years on a number of these projects. I won't thank them individually, but I want to start by acknowledging the moment we're in, which is the pandemic. And this has challenged all of our assumptions, our expectations about health and work, travel, teaching, socializing, even the wardrobe has massively changed in the last 9 months. And it's really interesting because it was just completely unpredicted. For most of us, we had no idea this was coming. And it's caused this sense, I believe, of reconsidering all of our assumptions. Now, there's also been, simultaneous with this is that we're living in a time of great political polarization. There's, especially in the last week or so, we've been living in a huge amount of uncertainty. And this is amplified the anxiety that we've already felt. Now, I don't know if you can remember, but there was a time when our biggest concern was artificial intelligence and whether it was going to steal our jobs. So much has changed since then. And what I want to do is talk about AI. I want to talk about robots and take you on a tour of some surprising stories about the history of robots and our own hubris and various existential threats to humanity, and try to provide some context that maybe can lead to a constructive perspective on where we might go from here. So I'm going to start going all the way back to the ancient Greeks and Greek mythology. And so when we think about anxiety, it's got a very rich history. And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, he recounts the story of Pygmalion, who was the Greek sculptor who was so skilled at sculpture that he made a statue of a woman who was so lifelike that he fell in love with the statue and essentially was driven mad. And this is essentially provides the blueprint, this story, for a host of stories to follow. In particular, consider the Golem of Prague, the Jewish tale about a rabbi who's feeling waves of anti-Semitism in his time in the 1500s, and then constructs a creature out of clay, a golem. And the creature comes to life. He writes on the name, the word Emet, truth, on the forehead of the creature. And the creature comes to life and then fights off the villagers, and the rabbi then decides that he'll put this golem to work. And he asks it to carry water and start doing errands for him. And after a while, the golem starts to essentially run amok and essentially starts carrying water and flooding the synagogue where the rabbi lives. And the rabbi can't essentially turn it off. And so he finally reaches up and he wipes the magic word on the golem's head, and Emet, he wipes off part of it, and it turns into the word met, which is death. And the creature collapses and on top of the rabbi and crushes him to death. Now that story also has a very strong reminiscence with other stories of the time. There was a lot of interest in the idea of an automaton, of machines that could be made, creatures that could be made and constructed to perform miraculous things. Leonardo da Vinci had a mechanical horse. Jacques Vaucanson was very well known as a constructor of elaborate clocks and also mechanisms, toys that would play the flute, that could sign their name. There were really magical feats of mechanical engineering at the time. And one of them that's really stands out is the story of von Kempelen, who constructed a chess playing robot. And what was very interesting was that it was a toured throughout Europe, but the secret was that it actually had a small human being positioned inside the cabinet who would essentially move the arms of the robot remotely from inside the cabinet, and it would play chess. And it turns out that the person inside the cabinet was actually a trained, very highly skilled chess player. So it would beat people who would come up and play chess with it. And this thing toured all around Europe, and it remained a mystery for many years. It actually came to the United States and toured through the United States as well. And there's an entire wonderful series of books about Mechanical Turk. But it's also very interesting to think about in the context of the perspective of why was it a Turk? And we'll come back to that. So going on historically, we come to the story of The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann. And he wrote this compelling, very disconcerting story about a boy who falls in love with an animatron, an automaton, essentially a robot. And it was a form of a female robot and was very beautiful. And the boy was convinced she was real, which again sounds like Pygmalion. And this case, the boy is very unnerved by the evil magician who has created this being, and he gets into all this anxiety and fear around what the magician might do to him, and he has a lot of ambiguity about who's real and who's not. And so this story becomes the basis, and very very much related to the book that comes out very closely 2 years later, which is by Mary Shelley, which is Frankenstein. And Frankenstein, as we all know, is a timeless story about the creature, again, that's created and essentially runs amok. And it is also reflective of the hubris of Professor Dr. Frankenstein, who has the audacity to build such a creature. It's also reflective of the technology of the time, which was, there was the idea of galvanism, the idea that electricity could actually be part of what drives the living beings, living organisms. So this story became incredibly potent and continues to resonate today. Now, it's also interesting that 100 years later, in 1918, the world experiences a massive pandemic. And this is a hospital ward from that time, but it's almost interestingly forgotten from a lot of history texts. When we look at the period after World War, or during and after World War I, it's not often mentioned that this was simultaneous with this massive international biological event that kills millions of people and is very much relevant today. Now, that was 1918. In 1919, so just as the pandemic is winding down, Sigmund Freud writes a book that comes out and is known in English as the uncanny. And the uncanny is a treatment, it's Freud's aesthetic analysis of Gothic literature. In particular, it's of E.T.A. Hoffmann's story, The Sandman. And Freud, as a psychologist, is very interested in what he calls a specific emotion that the Sandman triggers, that he calls the uncanny. And it's the sense that you're looking at something that's familiar, like a doll, and yet it suddenly becomes strangely unfamiliar. And that play off of familiarity and unfamiliarity is what he calls the uncanny. And there is no quite equivalent of word for this in English. Now, one way to think of it is the word deja vu, which we're familiar with, is when you see something strange and you feel like it's strangely familiar. You've been there before. Now, the uncanny is almost the opposite. It's where you see something familiar, but it suddenly becomes strange. It doesn't feel comfortable. And that sense of familiarity and discomfort is really what Freud's talking about. And this is really in his essay, which itself actually exhibits a fair amount of uncanny elements. And I recommend it very highly. It's fairly short, maybe 30 pages or so, but it's filled with these allusions to aspects of our human experience and this strange emotion that he gives a name to and then starts finding all over, and especially in literature. Now, in 1 year later, and so this is, pandemic is 18, Freud is 1919, 1920 is a monumental moment because it's the year that the word robot is coined. And it's in a work of art. It's by Karel Čapek, the Czech playwright, writes a play about robots, essentially, that are essentially oppressed, they're working, they're overworked, and so they rebel. And this is when the first time the word robot is ever used, and it again is quickly adopted. This play becomes wildly successful and is used all over the world. It triggers, for example, the very famous film by Fritz Lang a few years later, Metropolis, again featuring pretty much the same story of in this case it's a female robot who leads a revolution and the social dynamic that occurs with the human workers. Isaac Asimov in 1950, shortly after World War II, writes the book I, Robot, with a number of short stories, really interestingly weaving questions about the nature of robotics and what robots really mean and how they will be controlled. And he has the famous 3 laws of robotics. And I encourage you also to look at this. Some of these stories are fairly short, including one called Runaround, which is incredibly insightful story about how robots can be programmed in a contradictory way. And so the idea of robot really starts to take on a life of its own as more and more science fiction and writers and films and comics start to adopt it. Now, it's also being used in art. So in 1960, Nam June Paik, the Korean artist, comes to New York and starts to exhibit these series of robots. These are very abstract humanoid creatures or forms that he then programs in various ways and animates with televisions and other forms. But that's where the idea of robotics starts to enter into the mainstream art world. And 10 years later, Masahiro Mori is working in Japan, in Tokyo, and he's designing robots, in particular prosthetics, so to replace the hands and limbs of people who have been injured. And he makes an interesting observation. He said that if the hands are of the prosthetic hand, the replacement hand, is too similar to a human hand, then it will trigger this uncomfortable feeling. People won't actually want it. They won't feel comfortable with it. And he coins the term the uncanny valley to describe this. And he has this famous plot, as you can see here, where you can plot as something becomes more human, so that's what's happening on the x-axis, then it becomes more likable. That's what he's saying. So if you can see these 3 robots, if you make them, as a robot becomes more human, it becomes more likable, but up to a point. So Mori notes that if you make it too likable, there's this phenomenon that seems to happen where it suddenly is very unlikable. So if it's too human, it becomes too close for comfort, essentially. And that's that uncanny valley down here, where you see that head, which is clearly not human, but close enough that it just gives us the creeps. And that is really the same exact emotion that Freud was talking about earlier in the century. And again, if it really is a human, as in the upper right, then it becomes likable again. Now, this whole dynamic between what is real and what is not real plays out in the Blade Runner film and its predecessor by Philip K. Dick, To Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which comes out in '68. very interesting because if you remember this scene where Decker confronts the other beings, and the test here is whether or not they have sympathy or empathy. This is the empathy test to see if the replicants are human or not. And so again, we're getting into this territory where there's this emotional connection between what is alive and what isn't. Now, this is an example of the uncanny valley I used earlier. This is Hiroshi Ishiguro in Japan. These are a number of his, what he calls geminoids, or basically replicants of himself and his friends. And he's been making these for a number of years. And I hope you will agree that they're somewhat discomforting. Now, here's another example of a different creature. Many of you have seen this. This is the Boston Dynamics big dog from a few years ago, and this is it running around in the woods. Many people, including myself, have a somewhat uncomfortable feeling when we see this. Again, it seems to be close to the uncanny valley, right? It's lifelike, but not quite. And I really like this parody that was made around the time that video came out. There are actually a number of parodies like this, but this is my favorite, where they simulated the original video quite effectively. So this is, I think, a very natural response to the uncanny, which is to try and address it with humor. All right, so now I want to just touch on some of my own work and put it into the context of the uncanny, which is that for the most part, we think of the uncanny as what I would call representational uncanny. It's something that looks lifelike, but isn't. But I believe there's something else, which is what I would characterize as the experiential uncanny, which is where something feels, an experience feels real, but isn't necessarily. And in particular, I just want to touch on two projects. One is known as the Telegarden. And this was a project my students and I developed now 25 years ago, where we took a real industrial robot arm and put it in the center of a living garden. And then we connected this over the internet. And at this time, it was 1995, the internet was in its just the beginning, early days. So we weren't sure if anybody would operate this or what would happen. And we set it up and we made it available 24 hours a day. And there were no rules. Essentially, anybody could do whatever they wanted. So you could come in and you could visit the garden. You could, by clicking, you could steer around on your browser. And then if you wanted to, you could help us tend the garden by watering. And if you watered for a certain amount of time, we would give you your first seed. And you would be able to plant your first seed in this garden and come back to watch it grow. So again, we weren't sure how many people were going to come and participate. It's about 3 meter by 3 meter garden. And this is a reconstruction of what we call the seasons, where suddenly we got tens and hundreds and thousands and then tens of thousands of people coming into the garden. And if any one of you are gardeners, you know that at a certain point, this becomes completely untenable and unstable. So it became more of a study of the tragedy of the commons than we ever considered at the onset. But this became really interesting to us, and it raised a number of questions that we then wrote about in a book called The Robot in the Garden that came out in the year 2000 from MIT Press. And we included in this book essays from 6 artists, 6 philosophers, and 6 engineers. So in looking at these questions about what does it mean, essentially, what is the status of knowledge over a distance, and was looking at something broader about essentially topics that were much more interesting today in terms of what is the line between virtual reality and what we might call distal reality. So virtual reality is something is a fiction, it's made inside the computer and looks incredibly real. And distal reality is where you're remote from something, as we are tonight, and you're experiencing something that looks real, but is far away from you. And the question is that green line between the two. Where is that? How do you draw that distinction? And it becomes increasingly difficult when virtual reality becomes more sophisticated and distal reality becomes more a part of our mediated daily existence, as it is in the last 9 months. Now, at the beginning of actually just before the pandemic, about a year ago, my students and I started working on a successor to the Telegarden that we called the Alpha Garden. And the concept here is, rather than have a garden that's controlled by people remotely from all over the world, the idea is to have a garden that gets tended by a robot, by an AI system. And the name is meant to be related to AlphaGo, the system that played the world champion and beat the world champion at the game of Go from DeepMind and Google. So Alpha Garden is meant somewhat as a critique of the promise and the expectations of AI, because we thought, could a robot really tend a garden with all of its nuance and complexity? So we wanted to set this up as an art installation and as a research project. So here's the garden in the greenhouse at Berkeley. And it's about 3 meters long and 1.5 meters wide. We use a commercial robot, the FarmBot gantry robot, as you can see on the left, to tend it. And this is the garden after about 6 or 7 weeks of growth. And the idea is, this is an overhead view. We have a camera overhead, and we're able to take images as the garden grows. Every day, the students capture an image, and we stitch them together into a time lapse. And what's interesting is that over time, you can see that you can watch the garden grow, and it becomes quickly very overgrown. And then something completely unexpected happened. We were informed that because of the pandemic, they were going to make that no one was allowed access into the greenhouse. And that meant that there was no way to control the irrigation system. And so what you're now starting to see is the late stages of the garden, that it opened in January, but this is about maybe February, March. It's starting to essentially suffer from essentially an intense drought. So it hadn't been getting any water. And what's so interesting, and what we didn't expect, was that we would be able to have essentially an eyewitness account of the death process for this garden. And if you watch carefully, what happens at this stage is now it's really becoming desperate. And you can see that the garden is shooting out flowers, is shooting out last sort of gasps for water. And you're watching this process, which wasn't what we expected to be showing. And it became, for us, very, very resonant with what was going on at the time, which was that nature was reasserting itself with respect to technology. And I think that last scene, the end point of that garden is, to my mind, looks like Guernica, the sort of that sense of struggle at the end of an intense onslaught, and of something that I think we can all relate to in terms of what we've been going through over the last 9 months. So this brings us back to anxiety and this sense of emotions, this mix of emotions that we're all feeling and trying to come to terms with. And I want to return back to the topic of artificial intelligence now, because I think it is relevant to reconsider where we are with AI in the context of the global pandemic and political situation and all of the polarization that's happening. And I want to say that I think, first of all, I think it's been very interesting that artificial intelligence has been remarkably has been ineffective at resolving these problems, that both with social media and controlling fake news, artificial intelligence has actually been fanning the flames rather than restricting them. And artificial intelligence also has been surprisingly ineffective for addressing cures or vaccines for the pandemic. So I think that's sobering. It's very valuable to correction to the hubris that we've been experiencing around it. And I want to come back to the idea about jobs and fear that robots and artificial intelligence will steal our jobs. Now, there's been a huge amount of promotion out there, and it still goes on, about the robots like this Sophia, who are incredibly lifelike. And then we see this kind of thing from Boston Dynamics. This is not their dog, but the subsequent Atlas robot. As you can see, it looks like it's about to triumph. But we see, if you look more closely at that video, that if you stay to the end, this is actually a little more of the real situation. And that's what I want to say as a roboticist, which is that we can see amazing moments in robotics and AI, but the reality is that progress is moving much slower than is commonly believed. Now, in the context of the coronavirus, where we're struggling with this new unprecedented development in terms of world population, the idea, I want to make an analogy now with something that happened at the around the last pandemic, which was there was a lot of fears about immigrants at the time. If you recall, it was known as the Spanish flu, and there was idea that there was somehow that immigrants were responsible or that they were causing some of the danger. In fact, it was around this time that there was a real sense, at least in California, of xenophobia around immigrants from Asia, and it was what was known as the yellow peril. There was a lot of xenophobic feeling that was very, very prevalent at that time. And I really like this quote from Oliver Morton at The Economist, and he says that today robots are immigrants. And if you really think about that robots have this very strong analogy with immigrants. And it's not that they're immigrants from a foreign country that we don't know or unfamiliar with, but they're immigrants from the future. And I really like this statement. I think it's really speaks volumes about the way we think about machinery and AI and technology more broadly, and how we have a mix of attraction and fears surrounding it. And this idea, this mix of emotional dynamic that happens around the unknown, the unfamiliar. Again, we talked about it in the context of the uncanny, but it also plays out in a term called exoticism. And that is an attitude toward the cultures, colonial cultures primarily, but cultures that we are not familiar with. And we tend to exaggerate their positive possibilities and also exaggerate their negative possibilities. And this idea, this concept of exoticism, was adopted by Edward Said in his book in 1978 called Orientalism. And he applied it to the Middle East. And to particular, as a Palestinian, he applied it to views of the Middle East and Islamic cultures, but it applies to Asian cultures, it applies to almost any culture that is not familiar, that may be uncertain. And so I think that this is a helpful guidepost for us now to thinking about the way we're addressing robots. And so coming back to von Kempelen and the mechanical Turk, which was, again, I believe that's a hint, that's a valuable hint to helping us understand that what was so compelling was that it was also exotic. And the Turk was an example of Orientalism. And we might almost call it robo-exoticism. The idea that robots also have this kind of very analogous type of mythology attached to them. Now, as I wrap up and we take some questions, I want to make this distinction between robots and humans. That we know that robots are very good at the things on the left. There's no doubt that they can beat us in calculations, precisions, objectivity. But what they don't have, they've made very little progress on the things on the right: understanding, empathy, and dexterity, the ability to actually hold and manipulate objects reliably. So I want to posit that because these two forces are very different, these two elements, that robots and humans are not antagonistic. It's not one beating over the other, but actually there's a huge possibility for them to be complementary, that the two complement each other. The strengths of one are balanced by the weaknesses of the other and vice versa. And I want to use this example that I know my students won't recognize, but some of you will, which is Star Trek. And if you remember that Spock is essentially very close to a robot. He operates purely on logic and rules, and his counterpart is Kirk, Captain Kirk, who is all about emotion and empathy and ability to communicate and instinctive responses. And the two of them together are incredibly powerful. That they really are complements of each other. And then they can go out and take on the biggest problems in the universe. So I think this is relevant today. I think that thinking about the complements between human and robot is very effective as a way of starting to just rethink the moment that we're in terms of the pandemic. And I think that we can look at robots as mirrors, that robots are in some sense reflective of our own hopes and fears, and they can help us see ourselves in new ways. And I know this is a stretch, but I think it's a little bit related to our political moment as well, namely that we have this polarization, but maybe we can turn it around and see in some way that the opposition is in some way helping us to understand ourselves better. That we, on whatever side we're on, have had to become more acutely aware and self critical and self actualized over the last 4 years. So, and maybe that will continue in the future. In other words, maybe we have learned a positive lesson from all the challenges that we've been facing. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you might have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm looking through the chat here, and it looks like people want to know more about the author and the books that you referenced. Is there a place where you've cited your sources?
I can do that. No, I haven't. It's not online. But which one in particular they're asking about?
Let's see. Let's see, which book and author? There were two. Anyone in the chat that you had just mentioned, so that doesn't help.
Oh, Segalin and yeah, it was Edward Said from Exotic Orientalism. Edward Said, S-A-I-D,
Okay.
and that's easily to find online, Amazon. And the other is Segalin, and that's Oriental. Sorry, that's Exoticism, also on Amazon.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. Here's
Sure.
another one. Considering the complexities of a potential COVID-19 vaccine and short life of antibodies, do you believe a nanotechnology may be a solution?
Well, this is where my skeptical side is going to come out. I am not a huge optimist about nanotechnology. I think that there's places where it has that there have been advances, but I think that was one of the technologies that was largely overhyped in the last 20 years. And it was because there were, in its many forms, but the term was powerful. But then it was this idea that we would build these small machines that would be able to inject them into our bodies, and they'd go through and they'd clean up our arteries, et cetera, and fight viruses. And that always felt a little more like science fiction to me than something practical. And unfortunately, 20 years later, we still don't have that. And I think that we have to be on guard. It's a little bit like the jetpacks that everyone was talking about in the 50s and 60s. There are some technologies that just aren't practical. And although I know that there have been jetpacks spotted around Los Angeles, LAX in the last couple of months, but these are not, for various reasons, it's not practical to build a safe jetpack that's efficient. Now, maybe that'll change, but it's not coming anytime soon. And even though it seemed like it should be coming, and I would say people have been thinking the same thing about self-driving cars, that it may turn out that self-driving cars, and I will be willing to bet on this, we're not going to see them in the near future. So I want to say that it's important to be a little bit, have our eyes open, our skepticism up about some of the technologies we hear about, because they don't always turn out the way we expect.
Yeah. All right, this one just came in. And for all the folks asking, yes, we will be posting this on YouTube. So we've been recording this and we will post it on YouTube. So this question just came in.
Okay.
It seems to me that the majority of the public is not currently positioned to have a nuanced conversation about AI and tech. I seem to find that people swing between all tech is bad and tech is the future. I get the feeling that most people don't have access to the vocabulary to articulate their thoughts and feelings about tech. Do you agree? And if so, why do you think that is, and how might we change that?
Great question. Good. That's perfectly really consistent with what I've been thinking about and talking about here. I think that there is a polarization, and we still have many who believe that technology is the answer to everything, and a great belief in you hear this all the time. It's been in the press that AI is on the cusp of surpassing humans, and will either lead to great discoveries or great, overwhelming takeover of our jobs. And I think that it's very important. There's these two extremes that come up, and both of them I think are exaggerated. I and most of my colleagues do not believe that AI is on the cusp of overtaking human capabilities. In certain areas, it already has, like if it's a matter of just doing certain things like spot welding. But in terms of really solving interesting problems, of doing nuanced things like even working in a restaurant, in a kitchen, is so complex, cleaning a house, or helping in terms of childcare or senior care. We're far from having robots that are capable of doing that. So I think that there is this polarity between views of technology, and as you said, it may have to do with language, how we think about it. At some degree, it goes back to a polarity that exists on campuses, which is between the two cultures. So C.P. Snow, in his book, The Two Cultures, in 1959, it really marks out this distinction between in his case, the two cultures are the humanities versus the sciences and the engineers. And I will tell you that distinction is still alive and well to a large degree. And and I feel that that's one that we should be able to overcome, and it is possible, but both are extremely valid viewpoints, but very different. And so the way to overcome them is to understand and have mutual respect between them. Understand that there's many myths in both of those cultures that are often seen from the other side, and those myths are believed because they're not understood. And just as exoticism and Orientalism is a very powerful insight and set of observations that came from humanities, I find it really helpful from the science and engineering side to think about that as a powerful way of thinking about the way we think about technology. So that's one piece of language or of linguistics that I think can be useful. And I think there's many others within the realm of humanities that we should be able to look at, to learn from each other, and to borrow from, and to test out, to be able to start to understand new ways of thinking about these problems that we're facing.
Yeah, so we're getting so many questions and we're running out of time. So we'll compile them all and send them to you, Ken.
Oh, good. Okay.
One last one, and this feels like a good note to end on.
Okay.
Are there any writers or artists that you would recommend to think about post-human histories and immigrants of the future?
Oh my God. Okay, great. I love that question. Absolutely. I'm going to, there's one that, there's a number. Machines Like Me by, where is it? Where's my copy? By Ian McEwan, is a novel that takes the Greek, the Frankenstein story, excuse me, to a new level. It's a fantastic book. There's a book by Richard Powers, a novel called Galatea 2.2, which was written in 1995, incredibly powerful. And I will be happy to, we can put that also on the YouTube channel. And I would say there is an ongoing stream of really interesting books that are coming out to really analyze these topics and issues. And so I would say that stay tuned. There's one more I'll mention is, this just came out. It's called The Alignment Problem, that I have on my desk here. It's by Brian Christensen. So that's also a new way of looking at artificial intelligence and across multiple disciplines. So I think that things like what the DeYoung is showing in the in the AI and the and humanity exhibit is so interesting and relevant. And thinking about how artists view these problems, how they wrestle with them, how they portray them, how they reflect them is going to be incredibly useful as we go forward. So I encourage you to see the show. I know a number of the pieces of it are online, and I think this topic is going to be with us for the next 2,000 or 5,000 years.
Agreed, absolutely. And so questions keep coming in, so we will make sure to compile them all and we'll send them to you, Ken.
Okay.
And if anyone has questions about Wednesday nights or about the DeYoung, anyone can feel free to email us as well, publicprograms@famsf.org. But thank you so much, Ken. I look forward to doing this again soon.
Oh, that was terrific. Fran, thank you so much. And thanks to your whole team for doing this with us. I'm going to put my email, my email and my website online on the chat. And so if anybody has questions, you can follow up with me there. I'd be happy to answer them. And again, thanks for the opportunity. The museum is fantastic, and it's great that we able to survive the downtime on YouTube tonight.
I know, what a way to start. It seems like we
yeah,
a perfect way to build some anxiety.
You never know. You never know.
You never know. Right. Well, thank you so much, Ken. We really appreciate it. Uncanny Valley, Being Human in the Age of AI, is now on view at the DeYoung Museum until June 26, 2021. We recommend booking your tickets in advance online at tickets.famsf.org. Next week, join us for a special conversation with author Celia Starr as we learn more about Frida Kahlo's time in America. See you next week.